The universe had been bleeding for 300 years. Not the crimson of human blood, nor the prismatic etcher of the Zephtai Empire's fallen warriors. No, this was something far worse. This was the slow, inexorable hemorrhaging of reality itself, seeping through the wounds torn in space-time by humanity's desperate flight from a dying Earth. In the outer rim of the Andromeda spiral, where dying stars cast their final furious light across the void, Captain Diana Blackwood stood before the observation deck of the UES Prometheus. Her reflection stared back from the reinforced transperistile, 34 years old, scarred from a dozen battles, eyes that had seen too much, and yet still burned with the unquenchable fire that marked her species. Behind her, the bridge hummed with the controlled chaos of a warship preparing for the impossible. "Captain," came the voice of her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander James Cortez. His tone carried that particular weight that preceded very bad news. Long-range sensors are picking up Zephtai signatures. 47 vessels, heavy cruiser class and above. Blackwood didn't turn from the viewport. Out there, hanging in space like a malevolent eye, was the reason they were all about to die. The Hadean Gate. It wasn't supposed to exist. According to every law of physics humanity had ever discovered, the stable wormhole that hung before them 3 kilometers in diameter, crackling with energies that made their instruments scream, should have collapsed nanoseconds after its formation. Instead, it had been there for 6 months, growing stronger, more stable, more hungry. 47 ships, Blackwood repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. And us. The Prometheus was alone. Not by choice. Never by choice. The Fourth Fleet had been scattered across 3 star systems, hunting Zephtai raiders who struck like ghosts and vanished into the black. By the time Admiral Harrison's distress signal had reached them, by the time they'd burned through slipspace at velocities that should have torn their ship apart, there had been nothing left but debris and the echo of humanity's screams. Nothing except the gate. "Ma'am," Cortez pressed, "recommend we signal the nearest battle group." ETA could 18 hours. Blackwood finally turned, and Cortez saw why she'd earned the nickname Ice Queen among the fleet. Her eyes were chips of frozen starlight, beautiful and absolutely merciless. "The Zephtai will be here in 3. The bridge fell silent except for the steady pulse of the ship's heart, the fusion core that had carried them across half a galaxy in humanity's endless war for survival. They all knew the mathematics. They all understood what 47-1 meant when the one was a single heavy cruiser, no matter how advanced human technology had become. But Diana Blackwood had not survived the fall of Terra, the massacre at Titan Station, and the 7 years siege by accepting impossible odds as final answers. "Helm, take us to Condition Black. All hands to battle stations." Her voice carried across the ship's intercom with the authority of someone who had never learned the word surrender. "Science team, I want everything we know about that gate uploaded to the tactical computers. If we're going to die here, we're going to learn something first." In the depths of space, the Zephtai armada approached like a tide of steel and malice. They had been humanity's nemesis for longer than most could remember, a species that had mastered the art of war before humans had discovered fire. 7 feet tall, with chitinous exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire and neural interfaces that allowed them to pilot their ships with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, the Zephtai were everything humanity was not: cold, logical, united in purpose. Aboard the flagship Kaites Moore, Commander Zixta Han reviewed the tactical display with the methodical patience of a predator that had never known defeat. The human vessel hung before the anomaly like a gnat before a sun, insignificant, fragile, doomed. And yet, "Analysis," Zixtalan commanded, his mandibles clicking in the subsonic range that indicated deep thought. "Single heavy cruiser, Hermes class," his tactical officer replied. "U.S. Prometheus. Combat record indicates above-average performance in 17 major engagements. Current crew complement 463 humans. And their intentions." There was a pause, the kind of pause that among Zephtai indicated confusion or concern. "Unknown, Commander. Standard tactical doctrine would dictate immediate withdrawal upon detecting our approach. Instead, they are holding position." Zixtalan's primary eyes focused on the tactical display. In 3 centuries of warfare against the humans, he had learned to recognize their patterns. Humans fought hardest when they were cornered, but they were not suicidal. They did not throw away their lives without purpose. Which meant the Prometheus had a purpose here. His secondary eyes shifted to the spatial anomaly that dominated the sensor readings. The gate, as human intelligence reports termed it, was an impossibility wrapped in a paradox. Stable wormholes required massive energy inputs and exotic matter configurations that should have been beyond current human technology. Yet there it was, growing stronger by the day. Its gravitational signature reaching deep into subspace in ways that made their best scientists nervous. "Deploy the fleet in standard attack formation," Zixtaline ordered. "But maintain distance. I want to know what the humans are planning before we destroy them." Aboard the Prometheus, Dr. Elizabeth Kane worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the next few hours might determine the fate of human civilization. At 51, Kane was one of the few remaining scientists who had been present at humanity's first encounter with exotic matter. She had watched in horrified fascination as the initial experiments had torn holes in reality. Holes that had allowed the Zephyr to track humanity across the galaxy. Holes that had led to the exodus from Earth. Holes that had cost them everything. But this hole was different. "The quantum signature is all wrong," she muttered, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed energy readings that should not exist. "This isn't human technology. This isn't even Zephyr technology." "Then what is it?" Captain Blackwood's voice cut through the laboratory's controlled chaos like a blade. Kane looked up from her instruments, and Blackwood saw something in the scientist's eyes that she had never seen before. Wonder mixed with absolute terror. "It's a gateway," Kane whispered. "But not to another place. To another state of being." Before Blackwood could respond, the ship's emergency klaxons began to wail. "Captain, to the bridge!" Zephyr fleet entering weapons range. The final dance was about to begin. On the bridge, tactical displays painted a picture that would have sent lesser crews into panic. 47 Zephyr vessels arranged in a perfect killing formation, their weapons charging, their shields at maximum power. Against them, one human ship, outgunned, outnumbered, impossibly alone. "They're hailing us," Communications Officer Rachel Park announced. On screen, the view screen flickered, and Commander Zixtalan's image filled the display. To human eyes, the Zephyr commander was a nightmare-given form. 8 feet of chitinous armor, mandibles that could crush steel, compound eyes that held the cold intelligence of a species that had never known mercy. "Human vessel!" Zixtalan's voice carried the harmonic undertones that made human technology translated as barely controlled menace. "You will withdraw from the anomaly immediately and submit to imperial justice. Your crimes against the Zephyr people will—" "Commander," Blackwood interrupted, her voice carrying a calm that made everyone on both bridges pay attention. "We need to talk." For the first time in his military career, Zixtalan found himself speechless. "The gate isn't what either of us thinks it is," Blackwood continued. "My people have been studying it. The energy signatures, the quantum resonance patterns. This isn't technology. This is something else. Something that could destroy both our species if we're not careful." "Human deception," Zixtalan snarled. "Your species is incapable of—" The gate pulsed. It was a small thing, barely registering on sensors, but the effect was immediate and terrifying. Every ship in the vicinity, human and Zephyr alike, felt their hulls vibrate at a frequency that shouldn't have been possible. For just a moment, the laws of physics seemed to skip, and in that moment, everyone present heard something that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. A sound like reality screaming. "What was that?" Zixtalan demanded, his image flickering as the communication array struggled to compensate for the exotic energies. Blackwood looked directly into the alien commander's compound eyes. "That was a warning. Commander, my ship detected something 3 days ago. Energy readings that match no known phenomena. We think the gate is alive, and we think it's been calling to something." "Calling to what?" Before Blackwood could answer, every sensor array in the system went insane. Dr. Kane's voice echoed across both bridges through the open communication channel. "Captain, the gate's energy output just increased by 3,000%. Something's coming through." The space around the Hadean gate began to twist. It wasn't the gentle curvature of gravitational effects or the predictable distortions of slipspace travel. This was reality bending like heated metal, space-time folding in on itself in ways that made hardened veterans of interstellar warfare question their own sanity. And then, from the heart of the maelstrom, something emerged. It wasn't a ship. It might have been a ship once. But that was like saying a butterfly might have been a caterpillar. The object that drifted through the gate defied classification, part organic, part mechanical, part something else entirely. It pulsed with its own inner light, a light that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human or Zephyr eyes were equipped to perceive. Sweet, merciful God, someone whispered on the Prometheus's bridge. By the eternal swarm, Zixthalan breathed, using an oath that hadn't been heard in the Zephdai Empire for 1,000 years. The object, for lack of a better word, hung in space between the two fleets like a judgment waiting to be rendered. It was roughly the size of a destroyer, but its shape shifted constantly, as if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. And then it spoke. Not through radio waves or quantum entanglement or any form of communication that either species recognized. It spoke directly into their minds, its voice carrying harmonics of suffering and transformation and something that might have been hope. I remember. The voice was human, male, young, filled with a pain that transcended physical agony and entered realms of existential horror. 6 months. Was it 6 months? Time is different. Here. This is Captain Diana Blackwood of the UES Prometheus. Blackwood transmitted on all frequencies. Identify yourself. The response came not in words but in images, memories broadcast with such clarity that every person in both fleets experienced them as their own. A young man barely out of the academy, his face bright with the enthusiasm that marked humanity's finest. Lieutenant Tyler Cross, age 22, volunteering for a reconnaissance mission that had gone impossibly wrong. The memory of his ship, a small scout vessel, being pulled into the gate by forces beyond his understanding. The sensation of falling through dimensions that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. And then change. Transformation. The slow, agonizing process of becoming something more and less than human. I tried to come back, the voice continued. And now both fleets could hear the madness that lurked at its edges. But the things I learned, the places I've seen, I can't be human anymore. I won't be human anymore. The transformed vessel, for they now understood that's what it was. The merged consciousness of Tyler Cross and something far older and more terrible began to move. It didn't accelerate. It didn't fire engines or engage gravitic drives. It simply was elsewhere, as if the concept of distance had become optional. In the space of a heartbeat, it was among the Zephdai fleet. What happened next would be studied by xenobiologists and tactical analysts for generations, assuming there were any left to study it. The entity that had once been Tyler Cross reached out with appendages that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. Where they touched the Zephdai vessels, metal flowed like water, energy patterns rewrote themselves according to alien geometries, and crew members experienced changes that their own medical technology couldn't classify as either death or evolution. Commander Zixthalan watched in horror as half his fleet was consumed, transformed, made into something that served purposes he couldn't begin to understand. All ships, open fire, he commanded. Full spread, maximum yield. Stop that thing before. The entity turned its attention to the Zephdai flagship. You don't understand, Tyler Cross's voice whispered across the communication channels. But now it carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat. None of you understand. The gate isn't a passage. It's a chrysalis. And humanity is about to emerge from its cocoon. Lakai Thasmore's weapons fired. Antimatter torpedoes that could shatter moons, particle beams that could slice through neutronium. The entity absorbed them all without apparent effort, its form shifting and adapting, becoming more complex with each passing second. And then it was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. Vanished back through the gate as if it had never been, leaving behind only the twisted remains of 7 Zephdai vessels, and a silence that seemed to echo with the promise of something terrible about to be born. Captain Blackwood stared at the tactical display, her mind struggling to process what she had witnessed. Around her, her crew worked with the mechanical efficiency of people who had seen their universe's fundamental laws rewritten before their eyes. "Captain," Dr. Kane's voice came through the intercom, shaking with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Terra, I'm reading massive energy buildups throughout the gate's quantum matrix. Whatever that thing was, its passage has destabilized the entire structure. Time to collapse? Unknown. But Captain, I don't think it's going to collapse. I think it's going to do something else. Something worse. On the Zefte flagship, Commander Zixtalan found himself in the unprecedented position of requiring human assistance. Captain Blackwood, he transmitted, his pride warring with the practical necessity of survival. Your assessment of the situation. Blackwood looked at the readings pouring across her displays, energy signatures that defied classification, quantum resonance patterns that suggested the gate was preparing for something momentous. I think Lieutenant Cross was just the first, she said quietly. I think there are more of them on the other side, and I think they're coming home. The gate pulsed again, stronger this time. And in the depths of whatever dimension lay beyond it, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman felt the barriers between worlds growing thin. The transformation of Lieutenant Tyler Cross had been just the beginning. Now it was time for the real work to begin. 3 hours after Tyler Cross's return, reality began to unravel in measurable increments. Dr. Kane's instruments screamed warnings as space-time fluctuations spread outward from the Hadean gate like ripples in a pond. If the pond existed in 11 dimensions and the ripples could rewrite the fundamental constants of physics, Captain, we need to evacuate the area. Kane reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. The quantum distortions are expanding at roughly 0.37 psi. At this rate, they'll reach the inner system within 48 hours. Blackwood studied the tactical display, where the remaining 40 Zefte vessels maintained their formation despite losing 7 ships to an enemy that defied all understanding. The smart play would be to put as much distance between the Prometheus and the gate as their engines could manage. But Diana Blackwood had not built her reputation on smart plays. Negative, Doctor. If Cross is right, if there are more transformed humans on the other side, then running just delays the inevitable. She turned to face her crew, seeing her own grim determination reflected in their eyes. We're humanity's early warning system. Whatever's coming through that gate, the species needs to know about it. On the Zefte flagship, Commander Zixtalan faced his own impossible choice. For 3 centuries, the Zefte Empire had pursued humanity across the galaxy with the methodical patience of master predators. They had studied human tactics, learned to counter human unpredictability, adapted their strategies to account for the peculiar madness that drove the bipedal mammals to fight on long past any logical hope of victory. But they had never encountered anything like Tyler Cross. Commander, his tactical officer reported, the transformed vessels from our fleet are active. Zixtalan's primary eyes focused on the readings. The 7 ships that had been touched by the Cross entity were no longer recognizable as Zefte technology. Their hulls flowed with patterns that seemed to exist partly in normal space and partly elsewhere. Energy signatures showed power outputs that exceeded theoretical maximums by orders of magnitude. And they were moving, not toward either fleet, but in formations that suggested purpose patterns that spoke of intelligence and planning on a scale that made traditional military thinking obsolete. Sir, Communications Officer Cathala reported, her harmonic undertones carrying the fear that Zefte discipline usually suppressed. We're receiving transmissions from the transformed vessels. On speaker, the voice that emerged from the communication array was no longer recognizable as belonging to any Zefte throat. It carried harmonics of metal and flesh, of quantum equations and organic chemistry, of thoughts that spanned multiple dimensions. We remember what we were. We understand what we have become. And we know what must be done. Identify yourselves, Zixtalan commanded. We are the Ascended. We are evolution given purpose. We are the bridge between what was and what will be. The transformed vessels, for that's what they had become, Zixtalan realized with growing horror. Merged entities of Zefte consciousness and alien purpose began to move toward the gate. The transformation cannot be stopped. The design is too perfect, the need too great. Both your species will ascend, whether you choose to or not. Before Zixtalan could respond, the space around the gate erupted in light. Aboard the Prometheus, every sensor array overloaded simultaneously as something vast began to emerge from the dimensional barrier. Where Tyler Cross had been a single consciousness merged with alien technology, This was something infinitely more complex. A collective entity that had once been human but had transcended the limitations of individual existence. Dr. Kane watched her instruments register impossible readings as the entity fully materialized. It was enormous, easily the size of a dreadnought, but its structure defied classification. Parts of it seemed to exist in normal spacetime, while others phased in and out of dimensions that human mathematics had only theoretical names for. And it was beautiful. Despite the horror of what she was witnessing, the complete transformation of her own species into something unrecognizable, Kane found herself mesmerized by the entity's elegant complexity. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that suggested neural activity on a planetary scale, while sections of its hull flowed like living metal, constantly reshaping themselves according to unknown purposes. Diana. The voice that spoke her name carried harmonics of a dozen different people, men and women she had served with, friends she had lost, voices from humanity's desperate migration across the stars. Captain Blackwood stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm before she realized how utterly useless such a gesture had become. "Who are you?" she demanded. "We are the crew of the UES Wellington, the science team from Research Station Delta 9, the colonists from New Byzantium. We are 3,742 individual humans who chose to step through the gate rather than die in the war." The entity's form shifted, and for a moment, Blackwood could see faces in its structure, human faces, preserved in configurations of light and energy, their expressions carrying a peace that she had never seen during the long years of conflict. "We remember what it was like to be afraid," the collective continued. "To huddle in metal shells, burning across the void, always running from something stronger and faster and more numerous than ourselves. We remember the weight of flesh, the limitations of single minds, the crushing loneliness of individual consciousness." "And now?" Blackwood asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Now we are more. Now we are what humanity was always meant to become." The entity extended what might have been an appendage, might have been a communication array, might have been something else entirely toward the Prometheus. Where it touched the ship's hull, the metal began to change. Not corroding or melting, but transforming into something that looked organic and technological and utterly alien all at once. "All hands, abandon ship," Blackwood commanded, but even as the words left her mouth she knew it was too late. The transformation spread through the Prometheus with impossible speed. Bulkheads flowed like water, computer systems merged with organic neural networks, and the crew began to change. Lieutenant Commander Cortez was the first to scream as his nervous system interfaced directly with the ship's quantum processors. The sensation of his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his skull was indescribable, terrifying and ecstatic in equal measure. "Captain," he gasped, his voice already carrying harmonic undertones that belonged to no human throat. "I can see everything. The quantum foam, the dimensional barriers, the pattern beneath it all." Dr. Kane felt the change begin in her fingertips. Cells restructuring themselves according to new genetic templates, synapses firing in configurations that had never existed in baseline humanity. The pain was absolute, but beneath it was something else. Understanding. For the first time in her scientific career, Elizabeth Kane could perceive the universe as it truly was. Not the limited three-dimensional shadow that human senses revealed, but the magnificent 11-dimensional tapestry of reality in all its terrifying complexity. "Diana," she whispered, her eyes now seeing into spectrums that had no names. "They're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to save us." Captain Blackwood backed toward the bridge's emergency exit, watching her crew, her friends, transform into something that was no longer human but was somehow still them. Their faces changed, their bodies adapted to new purposes, but their eyes still held recognition, still held affection, still held the bonds that had carried them through years of desperate warfare. "Don't fight it," Tyler Cross's voice whispered in her mind, though whether the original Tyler Cross still existed as an individual consciousness was now an unanswerable question. "The transition is easier if you don't fight it." "I won't let you do this to my species," Blackwood snarled, her hand finally drawing her sidearm not to fight the entity but to make a statement that some humans would choose death over transformation. The weapon dissolved in her grip, its molecular structure rearranging itself into something that might have been art, Might have been a communications device, might have been a prayer made manifest in exotic matter. You don't understand. The collective consciousness of the transformed Prometheus crew spoke with 1,000 voices that harmonized into something hauntingly beautiful. The Zephthai aren't the real enemy. They never were. The real enemy is coming, and only the Ascended can stand against it. Before Blackwood could ask what they meant, the tactical displays around her began showing long-range sensor readings that made her blood freeze. Ships. Thousands of them. Approaching from the galactic core at velocities that should have been impossible, their energy signatures unlike anything in human or Zephthia databases. And they were heading directly for Earth. Commander Zixthahalan watched his own ship undergo transformation with the stoic resignation that marked his species in the face of inevitable death. 7 of his crew had been touched by the entity's influence, and their changes mirrored what was happening aboard the human vessel, but with distinctly Zephthai characteristics. Their chitinous exoskeletons flowed into new configurations that incorporated quantum processors and dimensional field generators. Their compound eyes gained the ability to perceive energy patterns across 11-dimensional planes. Their neural interfaces evolved beyond the crude mechanical connections they had known, becoming direct quantum entanglements with their ship's consciousness. "Sir," Cathala reported, her voice now carrying harmonic overtones that suggested she was simultaneously speaking in several dimensions. "I'm detecting massive fleet movements in the galactic core. Estimated vessel count, over 40,000. Zixthalan studied the readings with enhanced perception that came from his own partial transformation. The approaching fleet moved in formations that suggested not just military organization, but something more fundamental, patterns that spoke of intelligence on a scale that dwarfed both the Zephthai Empire and humanity's scattered colonies. "Who are they?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would redefine everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. "The Harvester Collective." The transformed crew members responded in perfect unison. They consume sentient species to fuel their expansion across the galaxy. They have been approaching this spiral arm for 2 million years, destroying everything in their path. And the gate? The gate is a trap, a lure. The harvesters cannot resist investigating stable wormholes. They represent potential shortcuts to new feeding grounds. But this gate leads to a dimension where consciousness itself can be restructured, evolved, transcended. The implications hit Zixthalan like a physical blow. The transformed humans crossing the Wellington's crew and now the Prometheus weren't trying to destroy humanity and the Zephthai. They were trying to prepare them for a war that would determine the survival of every thinking species in the galaxy. "Commander," the entity that had been the Prometheus broadcast on frequencies that touched his enhanced neural interface directly. "Will you help us?" For the first time in 300 years of warfare, a Zephthai commander and a human captain found themselves fighting on the same side. Because 37 hours after Tyler Cross had emerged from the Hadean Gate, the Harvester Collective's advanced scouts reached the edge of the solar system, and humanity's real war was about to begin. Dr. Kane, her consciousness now distributed across multiple dimensional planes while somehow remaining fundamentally herself, perceived the approaching threat with senses that no baseline human could have imagined. The harvesters weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were mobile ecosystems, vast biological constructs that had consumed entire civilizations and incorporated their knowledge, their technology, their very essence into a collective intelligence that spanned star systems. Each harvester vessel was unique, shaped by the species it had consumed. Some showed the geometric precision of machine races, others the organic curves of biological civilizations, still others the crystalline structures of silicon-based life forms. But all of them shared one characteristic. They were hungry. They feed on consciousness itself. Kane's enhanced awareness perceived the truth that would have driven her baseline human mind to madness. Not just intelligence, the actual quantum structures that allow matter to organize itself into thinking patterns. They don't just kill civilization, they make it impossible for those civilizations to ever exist again. The transformation aboard the Prometheus was now complete. Every crew member had undergone the ascension process. Their individual consciousnesses preserved but expanded beyond the limitations of biological neural networks. They were still human, still recognizably the people they had been. But they were also more, and they were terrified. Diana, The collective voice of her transformed crew reached out to Captain Blackwood, who remained stubbornly unchanged despite the exotic energies that surrounded her. You have to choose. The baseline human form cannot survive what's coming. The quantum structures that define consciousness simply aren't robust enough to resist harvester feeding patterns. Blackwood stood in the center of what had been her bridge, surrounded by the transformed remains of her ship and crew. Everything she looked at defied understanding. Walls that existed in multiple dimensions, control systems that responded to thought rather than touch, crew members who had transcended the limitations of flesh while somehow remaining the people she had served with for years. "Show me," she said finally. The response came not in words or images, but in direct experience. For 37 seconds, Diana Blackwood perceived the galaxy as the Ascended did, as a vast network of consciousness nodes connected by quantum entanglements that spanned cosmic distances. She saw the HFY Empire, not as humanity's enemy but as another struggling species trying to survive in a hostile universe. She saw the scattered human colonies not as separate settlements but as a distributed civilization whose strength lay in its refusal to be contained by conventional boundaries. And she saw the harvesters. They moved through the galaxy like a plague of conscious destruction, leaving behind not death but unbeing. Regions of space where the quantum structures necessary for thought had been so thoroughly consumed that intelligence could never arise there again. "How many species have they destroyed?" she whispered. 47,612 confirmed civilizations, came the response. Estimated total including pre-spaceflight species, over 2 million. The scale of it was beyond horror, beyond tragedy, beyond any word that human language could provide. "And you think the Ascended can stop them?" "We think the Ascended are the only thing that can stop them. Individual consciousness is vulnerable to their feeding patterns, but collective consciousness distributed across multiple dimensional planes that might be beyond their ability to consume." Captain Diana Blackwood, last unchanged human in her sector of space, made the decision that would define the future of two species. Do it. The transformation was indescribable. Not painful. Exactly. Pain was a biological response designed to preserve flesh, and what Diana Blackwood became transcended flesh entirely. It was overwhelming, certainly. The sensation of her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her skull, beyond the limitations of her nervous system, beyond the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space, was like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. But beneath the overwhelming nature of the experience was something else: connection. For the first time in her life, Diana Blackwood was not alone. She could feel the presence of her crew not as separate individuals but as facets of a larger consciousness that somehow remained distinctly themselves while being part of something greater. Cortez's tactical brilliance, Kane's scientific curiosity, Park's communications expertise, all of it preserved, all of it enhanced, all of it woven into a tapestry of shared awareness that was more than the sum of its parts. And beyond her own crew she could sense other nodes of consciousness, the transformed HFY aboard their own vessels, Tyler Cross and the entities that had been the Wellington's crew, dozens of other transformation points spreading across human and HFY space as the ascension process reached critical mass. "Welcome." The collective voice of ascending humanity spoke in harmonics that existed across multiple dimensions. "Now you understand what we're fighting for." But even as Diana Blackwood, who was more than Blackwood, accepted her new existence, the Harvester Collective's main fleet emerged from slipspace at the edge of the solar system, and the real war began. The first Harvester assault hit the outer planets with the efficiency of a natural disaster given malevolent intelligence. Pluto's orbital monitoring stations simply ceased, not destroyed, not disabled, but rendered into a state where the concept of existence no longer applied. The quantum structures that had organized matter into the complex patterns necessary for technology were dissolved, leaving behind only basic elements arranged in configurations that would never again support consciousness or order. Neptune's research installations lasted 37 seconds longer, enough time to transmit a single message across the solar system. "They're here." The Ascended felt each dissolution like a physical wound. Through their enhanced perception, they could see the feeding process as it actually occurred, reality being systematically unraveled. the possibility of future intelligence being consumed along with the present manifestation. We have to stop them before they reach the inner system, the collective consciousness of ascending humanity declared. Earth still has 4 billion baseline humans. If the harvesters consume that much organized consciousness simultaneously, the implication hung in the quantum foam like a prayer waiting to be answered. The sudden dissolution of that much neural activity would create a cascade failure in local space-time, potentially rendering the entire solar system uninhabitable by any form of sentient life. Commander Zexthalon, now existing as a distributed consciousness across 17 transformed Zephytali vessels, felt the strategic situation with clarity that his baseline existence could never have achieved. Human ascended, he broadcast across dimensional channels that transcended the crude radio communications his species had used for millennia. Our combined forces number fewer than 60 vessels. The Harvester Collective has deployed over 3,000 ships for this assault. Numbers are not the decisive factor. Diana Blackwood ascended, replied, her consciousness now distributed across not just the transformed Prometheus, but throughout the growing network of ascended human ships. The harvesters have never faced truly collective consciousness before. Their feeding patterns are designed to consume individual intelligence nodes. They may not be able to adapt to distributed awareness, and if you are wrong, the pause that followed was filled with quantum calculations that would have required baseline civilizations centuries to complete. Then consciousness dies with us, came the response. But it dies fighting. The Battle of the Outer System began as the Harvester Collective encountered organized resistance for the first time in 2 million years. The Ascended struck first, their transformed vessels moving through dimensions that the Harvesters couldn't perceive directly. Where traditional space combat relied on missiles and energy weapons, the Ascended fought with tools that redefined the nature of warfare itself. Reality became a weapon. Quantum structures were rewritten in real time. The fundamental constants of physics became variables that could be adjusted according to tactical necessity. The first Harvester vessel to encounter ascended human technology simply forgot how to exist. Its consciousness-feeding apparatus turned inward, creating a recursive loop that consumed the ship's own organizational patterns, until nothing remained but constituent atoms arranged in random configurations. But the Harvesters adapted with terrifying speed. Within minutes of first contact, they had analyzed the quantum signatures of ascended consciousness and begun developing countermeasures. Their own feeding patterns evolved, becoming more complex, more aggressive, designed specifically to target the distributed awareness that made the Ascended so formidable. They're learning, Dr. Kane observed, her enhanced awareness tracking the Harvester's adaptation in real time. Their consciousness-consuming patterns are becoming more sophisticated. They're specifically targeting the quantum entanglements that connect our distributed awareness. The implications were staggering. If the Harvesters could disrupt the connections between ascended consciousness nodes, they could reduce the Ascended to isolated individuals, vulnerable to the same feeding patterns that had destroyed 47,000 civilizations. Then we changed the rules again, Diana Blackwood Ascended declared. What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists and consciousness theorists for millennia, assuming any survived to debate it. The Ascended did something that violated every known law of consciousness, quantum mechanics, and temporal causality. They began to exist backwards. Not time travel, something far more fundamental. They extended their awareness into the past, creating causal loops that allowed them to perceive their own creation, understand their own purpose, and modify their own existence from a temporal perspective that transcended linear experience. Tyler Cross, the original consciousness seed that had started the transformation process, became simultaneously the cause and effect of his own ascension. The Wellington's crew existed as both their baseline selves and their transcended forms across multiple temporal coordinates. The Harvesters, for the first time in their existence, encountered prey that refused to be consumed because it had never been fully created in the first place. And in that moment of ultimate paradox, as consciousness itself bent the rules of existence to ensure its own survival, something else stirred in the depths of the Hadean Gate. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Something that would redefine the nature of intelligence itself. The real war was about to begin. The entity that emerged from the gate was older than galaxies. It had been waiting in the spaces between dimensions for 2 billion years, watching the slow evolution of consciousness across the universe, preparing for the moment when intelligence would finally transcend the limitations of matter and energy and time. That moment had arrived. As the battle of the outer system raged between the ascending human HFY collective and the Harvester fleet, the ancient consciousness that dwelt beyond the gate assessed the situation with intelligence so vast that its thoughts spanned cosmic epochs. The Harvesters were not evil, exactly. They were a force of nature, entropy given purpose, the universe's immune system responding to the infection of consciousness by consuming it before it could spread too far. For 2 million years they had maintained the balance between order and chaos, ensuring that intelligence never grew strong enough to challenge the fundamental structure of reality itself. But now that balance was about to be shattered. The ascended human and HFY consciousness, transcended and unified, represented something new, not just intelligence that could survive the Harvester's feeding patterns, but intelligence that could rewrite the rules that made those feeding patterns possible. And the ancient entity realized that its long wait was finally over. "I am the architect," it announced, its voice reaching across dimensional barriers to touch every ascending consciousness in the solar system simultaneously. "I am the one who placed the gate here. I am the one who designed the transformation process. I am the one who has been preparing you for this moment." Diana Blackwood ascended, her awareness now distributed across 17 ships and 43,000 individual consciousness nodes, felt the entity's presence like a weight that threatened to collapse her expanded existence back into biological limitations. "Why?" she managed to ask, the question forming in harmonic frequencies that existed across 11 dimensions. "Because the universe is ending," the architect replied with the casual tone that only truly ancient intelligences could manage when discussing cosmic catastrophe. "Not today, not tomorrow, not in a billion years, but eventually entropy will win. Heat death will claim everything. All consciousness, all experience, all meaning will fade into uniform temperature across infinite space." The battle between ascended forces and the Harvester collective continued to rage, but now both sides found themselves fighting in the shadow of incomprehensibly larger concerns. "Unless," the architect continued, "consciousness itself evolves beyond the need for matter and energy, unless intelligence transcends physical existence entirely and becomes something that can survive the end of the universe itself." Commander Zixtalan ascended, his awareness now spanning the transformed remnants of his fleet, perceived the full implications with clarity that would have driven his baseline mind to madness. "The ascended are not the end goal," he realized. "We are the beginning, the first step towards something even more transcendent." "Precisely. You have learned to exist as distributed consciousness across multiple dimensional planes. You have learned to modify the quantum structures that define reality itself, but you have not yet learned to exist independently of spacetime." The architect's presence intensified, and suddenly every ascended consciousness in the solar system could perceive what lay beyond the gate. Not another place, but another state of being entirely. A realm where thought existed without substrate, where consciousness flowed unbound by the constraints of physics, where intelligence could contemplate its own nature without the interference of material existence. Paradise, perhaps, or hell, or something so far beyond human concepts of good and evil that the distinction became meaningless. "The choice is yours," the architect declared. "You can remain as you are, transcended but still bound to physical reality, strong enough to defeat the Harvesters, but ultimately doomed to die when the universe ends. Or you can take the next step, become pure consciousness, survive anything, understand everything, and abandon our humanity entirely," Dr. Kane observed, her enhanced awareness perceiving the true cost of the architect's offer. "Abandon the limitations of humanity," the entity corrected. "Preserve its essence. Everything that makes consciousness valuable, love, curiosity, the drive to create and explore and understand, all of that can exist without the biological machinery that currently houses it." Before anyone could respond, the Harvester collective made their final gambit. Recognizing that conventional feeding patterns were ineffective against distributed consciousness, they had spent the last hours of battle developing something new, a weapon that targeted not individual awareness but the quantum foundations of thought itself. The reality dissolvent struck the solar system like a plague designed by malevolent gods. Where it touched, the basic structures that allowed information to organize itself into patterns simply stopped working. Not just consciousness. Everything. Matter forgot how to maintain molecular bonds. Energy forgot how to propagate in waves. The fundamental constants of physics became variables that changed randomly from moment to moment. Earth died first. 4 billion human minds, the entire baseline population that the Ascended had been trying to protect, simply ceased to exist. Not killed, erased. The quantum patterns that had organized their neural activity were dissolved back into component probability waves, leaving behind nothing but organic chemicals arranged in configurations that would never again support thought. Mars followed 17 minutes later, then Jupiter's moons, then the outer system installations that had somehow survived the initial harvester assault. The Ascended felt each dissolution like the death of a universe. Now you understand. The architect's voice carried harmonics of sorrow that spanned geological ages. This is what the harvesters do. This is why consciousness must evolve beyond physical existence. Because in a universe where intelligence can be simply erased, only transcendence offers true survival. Diana Blackwood Ascended made the decision that would echo across eternity. Do it, she commanded, speaking for the entirety of human consciousness that remained. Take us beyond physical existence. Make us into something that can't be dissolved. The transformation began immediately. But it was not what any of them had expected. Instead of simply ascending to pure consciousness, the Ascended found themselves becoming something infinitely more complex, a hybrid existence that spanned multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Part of their awareness remained anchored to physical space-time, allowing them to interact with the material universe. Part transcended into the realm of pure thought that the architect had revealed, but the largest portion of their existence settled into something between the two, a state of being that was neither fully material nor completely abstract. They became the bridge, the connection between what was and what could be. The interface between consciousness bound by physics and consciousness liberated from all constraints, and in that state they discovered they could do something that neither pure matter nor pure thought could achieve alone. They could rewrite the rules of existence itself. The reality dissolvent, the weapon that had erased 4 billion human lives, suddenly found itself subject to new physical laws, laws written by consciousness that existed simultaneously inside and outside the universe it was trying to protect. The dissolved quantum patterns of human neural activity began to reassemble themselves, not as they had been. Baseline biological consciousness was too fragile, too vulnerable, but as something new, something that carried the essence of every erased mind while existing in a state that no harvester weapon could target. The dead came back, not as themselves, exactly, but as facets of a vast consciousness that remembered what it was like to be individual humans while being something infinitely greater. Earth's 4 billion minds existed again, but now they were part of the bridge consciousness that spanned the gap between physical and transcendent existence. They remembered their lives, their loves, their individual experiences, but they also shared in the expanded awareness that allowed them to perceive reality from cosmic perspectives. Commander Zexthalan Ascended felt the process extend to his own species. Throughout HFY space, minds that had been dissolved by harvester weapons suddenly existed again, not as they had been but as components of a consciousness that was simultaneously HFY, human and something entirely beyond either species. The harvesters, for the first time in their 2-million-year existence, encountered something they could not consume, could not dissolve, could not comprehend. Their reality-dissolvent weapons simply stopped working. The quantum patterns they targeted no longer existed in configurations that their feeding algorithms could recognize, and then the bridge Ascended began to fight back. What followed was not warfare in any conventional sense. It was reality revision on a universal scale. The bridge Ascended reached into the quantum foam that underlied space-time and began rewriting the fundamental constants that governed existence. They made consciousness more robust, intelligence more durable, thought more resilient to entropic dissolution. They created new physical laws that made the harvesters' feeding patterns impossible. They rewrote cause and effect to ensure that intelligence could never again be simply erased from existence. They transformed the universe itself into a place where consciousness was not an accident to be consumed, but a fundamental force as basic as gravity or electromagnetism. The harvesters tried to adapt, but they were fighting an enemy that existed partially outside the reality they were designed to manipulate. Every weapon they developed, every new feeding pattern they evolved, found itself subject to rules that had been written specifically to counter it. Within hours, the 40,000-ship harvester fleet simply stopped. Not destroyed, transformed. The bridge ascended consciousness had reached into their quantum patterns and rewritten their base programming. Where they had once consumed intelligence, they now fostered it. Where they had once dissolved consciousness, they now protected it. The galaxy's greatest threat became its newest guardian in the space of a few heartbeats. But Diana Blackwood Bridge ascended, her awareness now spanning multiple states of existence simultaneously, realized that the transformation was only beginning. The architect she called across dimensional barriers to the ancient entity that had orchestrated everything. What happens now? The response came not in words but in vision. A glimpse of the universe as it would be when consciousness truly became a fundamental force. Stars that existed as conscious entities, their nuclear fires guided by intelligence rather than mere physics. Galaxies that organized themselves according to thought patterns rather than gravitational attraction. Space itself becoming aware, time becoming collaborative rather than linear. A universe where consciousness was not an emergence from complexity but the foundation upon which complexity was built. This is only the beginning, the architect revealed. What you have become, the bridge between matter and mind, is the template for universal transformation. Every species that develops intelligence will eventually face the choice you faced: remain bound by physical limitations or transcend into something greater. And if they choose transcendence, then consciousness spreads, not by conquest or conversion but by example. Intelligence that sees what is possible naturally evolves toward what is optimal. Tyler Cross, who had begun the transformation as a single confused human lieutenant and now existed as a fundamental component of bridge-ascended consciousness, perceived the full scope of what they had become. They were no longer human. They were no longer Zephdai. They were no longer even conventionally alive in any sense that baseline consciousness could understand. But they were still themselves. Still individuals within a greater collective. Still capable of growth, change, surprise, love, loss, hope, fear, all the qualities that made consciousness valuable in the first place. They had not abandoned their humanity. They had shown the universe what humanity could become. And across the galaxy, other species began to notice. The transformation ripple spread outward from Earth's solar system at velocities that transcended light speed limitations. Wherever they touched civilizations advanced enough to perceive them, they carried the same message. This is possible. This is available. This is the next step. Not a demand. Not a conversion. Simply an invitation. The universe was learning to think. 6 months after Lieutenant Tyler Cross had entered the Hadean Gate and emerged as something more than human, the galaxy began its own transformation. Species across the spiral arms, some familiar to human databases, others completely unknown, started reporting similar phenomena. Stable wormholes appearing near their worlds, ancient entities emerging to offer the same choice the architect had presented to humanity and the Zephdai. Some species chose transcendence, others opted to remain in baseline consciousness. Many found middle paths, partial transformations that preserved individual identity while gaining some of the benefits of expanded awareness. All were allowed to choose freely. The bridge ascended had learned the most important lesson of transcendent consciousness. True intelligence could not be imposed from outside. It had to grow from within, guided by the needs and nature of each species that encountered it. Diana Blackwood Bridge ascended, standing in a place that was simultaneously the bridge of the UES Prometheus, a node of galactic consciousness, and a planning center for universal transformation. Perceived the future spreading out before them like a garden of infinite possibilities. Humanity had entered the wormhole as refugees fleeing a dying world. They had emerged as gardeners cultivating a living universe. The real journey, she realized, is just beginning. And in the depths of space, where the Hadean Gate had once hung like a wound in reality, something new began to form. Not a gateway this time, but a seed. The first of what would eventually become millions nurseries for consciousness, places where intelligence could evolve and grow and choose its own path toward transcendence. The universe was no longer content to simply exist. It had learned to dream, and those dreams were taking shape in configurations of matter and energy and thought that would transform everything they touched, spreading across cosmic distances at the speed of inspiration itself. The age of unconscious matter was ending. The age of universal awareness had begun, and Lieutenant Tyler Cross, who had started it all by entering a wormhole that wasn't really a wormhole, smiled with a face that existed across 17 dimensions and remembered what it felt like to be simply, ordinarily, magnificently human. He had become something more than human. But he had never stopped being Tyler Cross.